the moment my boss deleted the 3 systems I had spent years building. He thought he had ended my career. What he did not know was that one call later, everything he tried to bury would become the reason I stepped into a higher position, as a stronger future, and eventually made my old company pay for the very work they once called a risk. My name is Clara Hayes. I am 52 years old, and more than half of my adult life has been tied to data, systems, sleepless nights, and business decisions that depend on every line of information being accurate. I am not the kind of person who walks into a meeting room with polished slogans and calls that strategy. I came up through real work, through systems running at midnight, through the moments when one failed process delayed a chain of reports, and through the pressure of fixing things before anyone else even knew how badly they could break. After college, I started as a junior database administrator at a regional credit union in Columbus. It was not glamorous work, but it taught me the most important lesson of my career. Data in finance does not live inside presentation slides. It moves through accounts, loans, reports, transactions, controls, and sometimes the survival of an entire institution. I learned to see systems not only as diagrams, but as consequences when they stopped working. Over more than 26 years, I moved through data architecture, led technical teams, and built reporting infrastructure from nothing for 2 regional banks. I knew what it felt like to be responsible for things that people only noticed when they failed. So, when I accepted the role of senior analytics lead at Brighton Financial Group, I genuinely believed I had found the right place. I thought practical experience, care, and the ability to solve real problems would be respected there. I was wrong. But it took me quite a while to understand that. My first years at Brighton Financial Group gave me every reason to believe I had made the right choice. It was a mid-sized bank with about $4 billion in assets, operating across several states. It was not so small that it lacked ambition, but not so large that every useful action was crushed under layers of bureaucracy. What I liked most was that departments still spoke to each other like real people. The fraud team knew what the lending team was dealing with. Compliance people could come down to our floor, pull up a chair beside a monitor, and ask directly why one number did not match another. Business teams did not treat data like a mysterious black box, and the technical teams did not hide behind complicated language. Nothing was perfect. Of course, there were old systems, patched processes, and reports whose origins only a handful of people truly understood. But it was the kind of imperfection that belongs to a living business, where people use responsibility and institutional knowledge to hold things together. During my first 2.5 years, my team and I built several things that mattered. Not all of them looked elegant on paper, but they solved the problems they were built to solve. I believed senior leadership could see that. I believed that if the results were clear enough, if the numbers were strong enough, if the internal users confirmed that the systems helped them work better, then the value would defend itself. That was where I was naive. I forgot that in some organizations, the most threatening thing to certain people is not failure. It is success that happens outside their control. Everything began to change when my direct director left Brighton to take a role in Seattle. His replacement was Michael Grant, a man whose resume could make any executive team feel safe at first glance. He had an MBA from Stanford, 15 years advising large corporations on digital transformation, and a history of speaking at conferences about innovation, standardization, and scalable operating models. What his resume did not say was that he had never actually managed a technical team responsible for production systems. He had never been the person who received the call at 3 a.m. when incoming data was wrong. End-of-day reporting was stuck, and dozens of downstream processes were waiting. On his first day, Michael changed the seating plan so his office had a better view of the parking lot. Our team room, once covered in whiteboards full of data flow diagrams, was replaced with canvas prints carrying motivational quotes about innovation. I tried not to judge him too quickly. I sat through his first all-hands meetings, Listening to him talk about standardization, vendor partnerships, and scalable frameworks, I nodded when appropriate and answered honestly when asked. But within a few weeks, I began noticing a pattern that unsettled me. Whenever I mentioned an internal solution, he called it a point solution. Whenever I talked about a system our team had built to solve a specific problem, he called it shadow technology. If you have ever worked under someone who uses polished language to dismiss real work, comment number 1, so I know you understand that feeling. Michael did not attack the systems directly at first. He simply renamed them in a way that made useful work sound dangerous. The first real collision between Michael and me happened around the early fraud warning model, about a year and a half before he arrived at Brighton. The fraud team came to me with a problem that had exhausted them for too long. The outside fraud detection tool we were paying for often identified suspicious transactions only after the damage had already been done. Sometimes it was hours late. Sometimes it was days late. For credit card fraud, that delay was costly. For wire transfers, it could be catastrophic. I spent 4 months building a custom machine learning model that analyzed transaction behavior in near real time, using around 40 features the vendor tool barely considered. We looked at transaction velocity between specific account types, geographic anomalies by time of day, device fingerprint sequences, and subtle behavioral patterns that only people close to the internal data would recognize. The model was not perfect when it launched. I never pretended it was, but every 2 weeks, I met with the fraud team, reviewed true positives and false positives, adjusted weights, added variables, and removed noise. That is how real systems mature, not through grand declarations, but through small, steady loops with real users providing real feedback. By the time Michael arrived, that model had helped stop more than $2,100,000 in fraudulent transactions that the vendor tool had missed. To me, that number was not just an achievement. It was evidence that when people understand a problem deeply enough, they can sometimes build something better than an expensive software package that sits too far away from reality. When I presented the quarterly fraud metrics and highlighted the contribution of the early warning model, Michael leaned back with an expression I would later learn to recognize very quickly. It was the expression of someone who had already reached his conclusion before asking the question. He asked how many sprint hours had gone into building and maintaining the system. I told him it was about 340 hours during the first year, including iteration cycles, plus roughly 4 hours per week for maintenance and tuning. He wrote that down, then asked about the contract with Apex Insight, the vendor providing our existing fraud detection tool. I knew the number, $180,000 per year. Michael immediately framed the issue the way he wanted it framed. In his view, Brighton was paying for a vendor solution and then using internal resources to build something that duplicated the same function. I told him it did not duplicate the function. It caught what the vendor missed. Even after counting internal labor at around $60,000 annually, the bank was still net positive by more than $1,800,000. He nodded. But it was not the nod of someone listening. It was the nod of someone waiting for his turn to speak. He talked about scalability, supportability, and dependence on a single person. I explained that the documentation was thorough. 2 other engineers understood the code base, and I had designed it to be maintainable. Michael simply thanked me for the context and said he wanted to revisit vendor consolidation as part of the technology roadmap. If you find this story useful, leave a like on the video, because sometimes one small interaction helps stories about real work reach more people. At first, I thought that exchange was only a professional disagreement. I assumed Michael needed more time to understand our internal systems before judging them fairly. But 4 months later, the second collision happened. This time over a project I was prouder of than almost anything I had built at Brighton. The retail banking division was losing depositors at a pace that made the quarterly reports uncomfortable. It was not yet a crisis, but it was serious enough for executives to start asking questions. The common explanation was interest rates. Competitors were offering better annual percentage yields on savings products, and customers were chasing returns. The retail team had been asking for rate adjustments for 2 years. But the chief financial officer was hesitant because the margin pressure would be significant. I looked at the data and saw a different story. The customers who were leaving did not look like rate chasers. Before closing accounts or moving money out, they showed declining transaction frequency, smaller, direct deposit amounts, shorter mobile app sessions, and lower engagement with products. To me, that did not look like people simply chasing a few extra basis points. It looked like a relationship slowly wearing down. I believed that if we could identify customers showing early signs of disengagement, the bank could intervene before they actually left. I pitched the idea to the vice president of retail banking, a woman who had been at Brighton for 20 years, sharp and deeply impatient with anything that only sounded good in theory. She gave me 30 days to prove the idea was useful. I liked that kind of challenge because it was clear, practical, and not hidden behind management slogans. I built a churn prediction model using 3 years of customer behavior data, then connected it to the customer relationship management system so relationship managers could receive a daily list of customers with elevated risk. The important part was that the list did not simply throw out a cold score. It also suggested specific actions, a check-in call, a product review, a conversation about recent experience, or simply a human touchpoint at the right moment. In the first month, the model identified around 340 high-value customers with significant churn probability. The retail team did not run a broad rate promotion. They did something more human and more intelligent: personalized outreach, real conversations, and reviews of actual needs. The result was that 62% of the flagged customers showed measurable re-engagement. The retail vice president ran the numbers herself and estimated that Brighton had retained nearly $4,800,000 in deposits in the first quarter alone. Money that likely would have left under the old approach. When I brought those results to Michael, I expected him to at least recognize what was happening. Instead, he opened our project tracking system, looked at the logged hours, and said the work had been scoped as a 40-hour exploratory analysis. While I had logged 127 hours and integrated with the customer relationship management system without going through the proper change process, I explained that the connection was read-only, created no write operations, changed no schema, and did not trigger change management under the current policy. He called that a technicality. I began to understand that for Michael, the larger the result, the harder my behavior was to forgive, because it proved that his process was not always the center of value. That conversation left a small but deep crack in me. Michael said 127 hours for a 40-hour project represented a serious resource allocation deviation. I said it represented nearly $5 million in retained deposits. He said what concerned him was a pattern. I kept going outside the approved scope of assignments because I believed my judgment mattered more than the planning process. I sat quietly for a moment, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was trying to understand whether I was truly wrong. Then I said, as calmly as I could, that I believed high-functioning teams delivered results. Michael smiled the way people smile when they think they have won a moral argument. He said perhaps we had different definitions of high-functioning. We did. To me, effectiveness means understanding a business problem correctly and solving it well enough that real users feel the difference. To him, effectiveness meant passing work through a process clean enough for him to present upward. I do not oppose process. I have spent enough years in finance to know that process protects organizations from carelessness and risk. But process should not become a curtain that blocks evidence. If a system helps retain customers, reduce risk, save money, and earn trust from internal users, the first question should not be, who gave you permission to do this? It should be, how do we govern this better? If you want to hear more real lessons about work, power, and value being misjudged, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories. 6 months later, the third collision happened. And this one truly broke something between Michael and me. Brighton's compliance function was exhausted. The bank had to satisfy multiple regulatory reporting requirements, quarterly reports, stress testing submissions, suspicious activity reporting, and other recurring obligations. Preparing those reports was almost entirely manual. Analysts pulled data from different source systems, reconciled discrepancies by hand, and reformatted outputs to match regulatory templates. Each reporting cycle took between 40 and 60 hours. The frightening part was not only the time, it was the error-prone nature of the process. In 18 months, Brighton had already made 2 material restatements because reconciliation errors slipped through during manual processing. The chief compliance officer came directly to me, bypassing Michael. Because she had worked with me before he arrived and knew who to speak to if she wanted something that actually worked. She asked whether there was any way to automate at least the extraction and reconciliation layer. I spent 8 weeks building a regulatory data pipeline, automated extraction from 7 source systems, a reconciliation engine that flagged discrepancies for human review instead of letting them pass silently, and standardized output templates that matched submission formats exactly. The first time the compliance team ran a quarterly report through the new system, preparation time fell from 52 hours to 9. The tool also caught 3 discrepancies that could have required another restatement if submitted. To me, that was not a personal trophy. It was the rare feeling of watching a system do exactly what it was born to do. The chief compliance officer sent me a bottle of bourbon and a handwritten thank you note. I still remember holding that note because, in my profession, the best work is often invisible. No one sends flowers because a process runs on schedule. No one applauds when data reconciles cleanly. People usually notice only when something breaks. So, a specific thank you from someone the system had truly helped meant more than any vague praise in a performance review. But Michael found out about the project 3 weeks after it went live, when the chief compliance officer mentioned it in an executive staff meeting. That afternoon, he called me into his office. His voice was flat and cold. He said I had spent 8 weeks on an unauthorized project, used cloud compute resources outside the budget cycle, and built a system touching compliance-critical data without a security review. I told him the chief compliance officer had approved the project, and she was a member of the executive team. Michael replied that she was not my manager. He was my manager, and he had not approved the work. The compute cost was $4,200, and it had appeared in his budget variance report that morning. I explained that the system saved 43 hours per reporting cycle across a team of 4 analysts, equal to about $18,000 per cycle, with 8 cycles a year. The annual savings came to roughly $144,000. The total build cost was just over $4,000. Michael closed his laptop with a precise click, as though he had shut not only the screen but the argument itself. Then he said my problem was no longer technical. It was cultural. I drove home that night in a strange state, not burning with anger, but heavy and clear. I genuinely asked myself whether I was wrong. I did not want to become the kind of person who uses results to justify every reckless decision. I knew that, in banking, processes exist for a reason. Bad data can lead to bad decisions. Uncontrolled integrations can create security risks. A system understood too deeply by one person and too shallowly by everyone else can become a weakness. I did not deny any of that. But when I calmly reviewed each situation, I saw that the real issue was not what Michael claimed. He was not truly afraid the fraud model would fail, because it was working. He was not truly afraid the churn model was useless, because it had retained deposits. He was not truly afraid the compliance pipeline would create errors, because it had caught errors the old process missed. What frightened him was that the results came from a method he did not own. He was trying to build a technology organization that did not depend on any single person. And that goal was not inherently wrong. But he confused reducing dependency with erasing expertise. Some problems cannot be immediately packaged into a vendor contract, a sprint template, or a slogan about best practices. Some problems require someone who has watched data live in the real world long enough to understand what it is saying. Michael called me a cultural problem. I realized he was right. Just not in the way he believed. I was a problem for a culture that valued obedience to process more than understanding the truth. Over the next few months, things escalated in the familiar way of someone building an administrative case. In March, I was placed on a formal performance improvement plan. Not because a system had failed. Not because customers had been harmed. Not because a report was wrong. Fraud slipped through. Or teams complained that I was not supporting them. The stated reason was that I had repeatedly deviated from approved project parameters and used unauthorized resources. It was 4 pages long, carefully worded, and technically accurate in narrow ways. That was what made it so chilling. It was correct in fragments and wrong in the whole picture. It was like watching a doctor break down a door to save a patient and writing only that she damaged property. I hired an employment attorney to review the plan. She said it was unusually weak as a basis for termination and seemed more about control than consequence. Meanwhile, I kept doing my job. The fraud model kept running. The churn prediction system kept sending risk lists to the retail team. The compliance pipeline kept processing reporting cycles. The numbers stayed strong. The people who actually used my work, the fraud team, the retail vice president, and the chief compliance officer, continued treating me like someone they depended on. Because they did depend on me. The most painful part was not being criticized. The most painful part was seeing the value I created recognized by the users, while the person with authority over my evaluation was trying to turn that same value into evidence against me. The final breaking point came on a Thursday in September. Michael scheduled what he called a technology strategy alignment session with the full executive team, the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, division leaders. Around 15 people in total, plus the technology leadership group. He had been preparing the presentation for 2 months. The rumor on the floor was that he would propose a major vendor consolidation initiative, moving several functions to enterprise software platforms and reducing what he called our internal development footprint. I entered the room without any strong sense of dread. I probably should have had one. Michael opened with 30 minutes on standardization, lower maintenance costs, better vendor support, reduced key person dependency, and alignment with industry practice. The presentation was polished, reasonable sounding. And to be fair, there were parts where he was not wrong. I nodded at those parts too. Then he moved to a slide about current technical debt and risk exposure. On that slide were my fraud model, my churn prediction system, and my compliance pipeline. All 3 were labeled as unsanctioned, fragmented solutions with single point of failure risk. I felt my jaw tighten. Michael walked through each system with the clinical detachment of someone who had already written the conclusion. The fraud model was described as a custom system outside vendor governance, dependent on one engineer's undocumented method. The churn system was described as an unauthorized customer relationship management integration. The compliance pipeline was described as unbudgeted cloud infrastructure outside the change framework. Every technical description contained something true. Every business context had been removed. I sat there listening to Michael present my work as a threat. And something inside me became quiet. Not peaceful, but quiet in the way a major decision becomes clear before it is spoken. Around me, the executives were processing the story they had just been given. Some looked skeptical, some uncertain, and some nodded because risk management language carries its own weight in a financial institution. The chief operating officer, who had seen the retained deposit numbers in a board presentation, looked uncomfortable. The chief compliance officer stared at the table. Then Michael advanced to his final slide, recommended actions. The first item was to sunset the 3 identified systems. The second was to expand the Apex Insight contract to cover the functions currently handled by the fraud model. The following items involved vendor evaluations for customer analytics and regulatory reporting automation. Then he looked directly at me. Not at the room, but at me. He said the organizational risk of continuing to operate systems that only one person fully understood outweighed any short-term performance benefit they may have delivered. He said Brighton was a regulated financial institution and could not rely on heroics. Then, in front of the entire executive team, he opened the internal project repository and archived all 3 systems, moving them into an inactive state, which meant their scheduled jobs would be disabled before midnight. The room went quiet except for the hum of the projector. I looked at the screen and understood something clearly. There was no version of this conversation I was going to win by staying. At that exact moment, the phone in my jacket pocket buzzed. I did not look immediately. I sat still while Michael finished his presentation and answered a few questions about transition timing, vendor cost, and implementation roadmaps. But inside me, something had already become final. He had just called roughly $7 million in documented annual value heroics in front of the people responsible for the bank's performance. He had done it publicly, deliberately, and calmly, as though consequences did not exist. When I had the chance, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. I opened my phone. The message was from Nathan Brooks, Chief Technology Officer of Northstar Financial Technologies, a well-funded fintech company building banking infrastructure tools for mid-market financial institutions. I had met Nathan at a conference about a year and a half earlier. We had stayed loosely in touch. Not close, but familiar enough to know each other's work. His message was brief. He had heard through mutual contacts that I might be at a crossroads. He had been watching Brighton's analytics performance for 2 years and knew whose work it was. He wanted to speak that day if I was available. I stood in the hallway for about 90 seconds, staring at those words. Some life-changing moments are not dramatic, like movies. There's no music, no bright light, no slow-motion revelation. Sometimes there is only a woman standing alone outside a meeting room, realizing that the door behind her has just closed, and the one in front of her may be the door she has been waiting for. I called Nathan. The call with Nathan lasted about 40 minutes. But it changed my direction faster than any strategy meeting at Brighton ever had. He did not begin with empty flattery. He said directly that Northstar was building a platform to help mid-market banks achieve analytical capabilities that only much larger institutions had previously been able to maintain. He knew about Brighton's fraud detection improvement. He knew about the customer retention numbers. He knew there was a person behind those results, not just a vendor. By the end of the call, I had a verbal offer, $310,000 in base salary, significant equity participation, the title of Chief Data Officer, and full autonomy to build the data function from the ground up. Nathan said he had been planning to reach out for months. When 2 people in Brighton's fintech vendor network mentioned within 48 hours that something was happening with the analytics team, he decided the timing was right. What struck me was not only the money or the title, though I will not pretend they did not matter. What truly reached me was that Nathan understood the value of the work before I had to defend it. He did not ask why I had gone outside scope. He asked how those capabilities could be turned into something that served more banks. After months of being treated like a risk to be managed, being seen as someone who built real value almost took my breath away. I inhaled deeply, turned back toward the meeting room, and knew I no longer belonged to Brighton. When I returned to the room, Michael was thanking everyone for their time. He saw me walk in and gave me the polite look of someone who believed he had just won. The look of a person waiting to be gracious to the defeated. He asked whether everything was all right. Clara. I looked around the room. I looked at the chief compliance officer, who had used my data pipeline to get through multiple reporting cycles without a restatement. I looked at the chief operating officer, who had seen the retained deposit numbers in a board presentation. I looked at Michael, who had just archived $7 million in annual value and called it risk management. Then I said that since everyone was present, I had something to share. I announced that I was resigning effective immediately to join Northstar Financial Technologies as Chief Data Officer. I said the three systems that had just been archived represented around $7 million in documented annual value, more than $2,100,000 in fraud prevention, nearly $4,800,000 in retained deposits, and about $144,000 in compliance labor savings. I said the teams depending on those systems deserved to know that those numbers had been removed from the context presented that day. Michael's composure cracked slightly, only for a fraction of a second. But I had been in enough meeting rooms to recognize the moment when someone's internal calculations stopped lining up. He said I could not make that kind of announcement in an executive session and that there were proper offboarding procedures. I replied that my employment agreement allowed immediate resignation. And since he had chosen a public forum to characterize my work as a liability, I thought it was appropriate to clarify the record in the same setting. The chief financial officer began asking Michael about the financial impact of sunsetting the fraud model. I gathered my notebook and coffee cup, then walked out. By the end of that afternoon, I had signed a letter of intent with Northstar. The next day, an accelerated background check process was completed, and Nathan brought me onto a call with his board to discuss the data strategy roadmap. The team at Northstar was much smaller than what I was used to managing, 7 engineers instead of 23. But they were talented, curious, and most importantly, they were working on problems that actually mattered. They were not asking how to make a slide sound innovative. They were asking how mid-market banks could detect fraud faster, retain customers better, and submit cleaner reports without maintaining a massive internal team. I did not reach out to anyone at Brighton. I did not need to. 3 weeks later, the chief compliance officer called me. She was professional and careful in how she framed the conversation. She said she was exploring options for maintaining the compliance pipeline capability and wanted to know whether Northstar offered services in that area. We spoke for an hour about regulatory data management, what good infrastructure truly looked like, and how automation could be built without losing risk control. Near the end of the call, she mentioned that the board had asked several pointed questions after I left, especially about the systems that had been archived. The following week, the retail vice president called. She had reviewed the first month of numbers after the prediction model went offline, and high-value account closures had increased by 31%. She wanted to understand what options existed for rebuilding the capability and whether Northstar worked with institutions of Brighton's size. I kept my tone professional, because that is what the work deserved. But inside, I knew the truth was returning to the meeting table without me having to drag it there. Over the next 3 months, Northstar signed 2 significant consulting engagements, one with Brighton's compliance function and one with its retail banking division to rebuild and properly productionize versions of the systems that had been archived. I was not the primary relationship owner for either account. I did not need to stand at the center of it to feel anything. The work spoke clearly enough. The people who had depended on it knew where it had gone. Through professional contacts, I later heard that the Apex Insight contract expansion Michael had proposed was delayed indefinitely after the fraud team tested the expanded configuration and found the detection accuracy significantly worse than the archived models. Performance. I heard the board had uncomfortable questions about the September technology strategy presentation. I heard that Michael left Brighton in February to pursue other opportunities. The phrase our industry uses when the conversation about staying has already lost most of its meaning. I do not want to pretend I was perfectly noble about it. If I said no, small part of me felt something settle correctly when I heard the news. I would be lying. But what I felt more strongly was simpler and more solid. The work was real. It survived the pressure of someone trying to erase it from the story. It lived in money, not lost. Customers who did not leave. Reports that did not need restatement. And people who picked up the phone when the systems disappeared. No one can completely delete a result once it has entered the real world. Today, I am building something at Northstar that I am genuinely proud of, a data infrastructure framework that helps mid-market banks operate with analytical capabilities comparable to institutions many times their size, without requiring a massive technical team to maintain it. We are growing quickly. Not because we sell a beautiful story, but because the problems we solve are real. People at those banks are tired of being told that their specific problems already have standard solutions when they know their data is more complicated than that. The young engineers on my team sometimes ask me about career strategy, what to do when their instincts are right but the process says otherwise. I tell them what I truly believe. Do the work that matters and document everything carefully. Not only to protect yourself from people who may try to take it away, but because work done properly leaves a record that outlasts the people who dismissed it. Your reputation is not built only in performance reviews. It is built in the systems that keep running after you leave the building and in the phone calls from people who remember what it felt like when things actually worked. The best revenge is not the title or the salary. Though I will not deny that the equity conversation with Northstar's board was deeply satisfying. The best revenge is that the 3 systems Michael archived in that September meeting are all running again. Rebuilt, documented, governed properly, and supported by a team. Just as he said they should be. The difference is that now they run at Northstar to serve Brighton as a client and generate revenue for the company that understood their worth when the company that created them did not. Sometimes, someone else's delete button is really a starting gun. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support the next stories.